At dawn, 2 clocks began to tick. One, set in Washington, commanded 48 hours. A demand to surrender 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil or face financial suffocation. The other, born in Ouagadougou, allowed 72 hours, a declaration that no mine, no pipeline, no barrel would leave the soil without the consent of the people who owned it. 2 clocks, 2 ultimatums, 1 battle for sovereignty. This was no exchange of letters. It was the collision of law and leverage, of empire and endurance. Trucks halted at checkpoints. Banks tested transfers that froze before they landed. Within ministries, officers unfolded sealed directives stamped by the president himself. 5 clear orders: freeze exports, audit every mine, replace foreign security, seize control of infrastructure, bring data home. Which clock would run the nation? The one from abroad or the one written on its own soil? Which countdown would mark defeat, and which would stand as a legacy? Stay with us. What comes next is not only history unfolding, it is a test of sovereignty itself. Subscribe and witness the story. The ultimatum from Washington did not arrive with negotiation or courtesy. It landed like a decree, stamped with arrogance. Surrender 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil within 48 hours, or be cut off from the arteries of the global financial system. No appeal, no extension, no dialogue. It was less an offer than a chokehold. But in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré answered with steel. He did not deliver a speech for applause. He signed a decree that gave 72 hours, not to submit, but to assert. His words were not wrapped in metaphor. They were directives written with the authority of a state reclaiming its soil. First, exports were frozen. No gold would leave until contracts were reviewed. Second, every mine would face a full audit to expose inflated figures and unpaid royalties. Third, foreign security staff were to be replaced by national forces sworn to defend the flag. Fourth, operational control, from server keys to drone surveillance, would shift to the state. Fifth, all data, geological or financial, would be relocated to domestic servers. These 5 orders were not suggestions. They were switches flipped overnight. Couriers carried sealed packets to the headquarters of multinational firms. Phones rang across the capital. Silence followed. Then the resistance began. An IT manager refused to surrender server access. A state officer placed a suspension notice on his desk. Credentials changed hands, and for the first time in decades, the flow of data no longer streamed to foreign nodes, but to secure servers under national command. The image was striking. Burkina Faso, often dismissed as peripheral, suddenly operating with the precision of a state determined to defend its inheritance. Trucks carrying ore were grounded at checkpoints, manifests scrutinized line by line. When one convoy attempted to force its way through at dusk, gendarmes halted it cold, escorting it back under guard. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the ultimatum was not theory. Radios relayed hourly updates. Market stalls echoed with whispered questions. Would salaries still arrive? Would banks still open? Would fuel still flow? Villagers guarded depots through the night. Young engineers, armed with little more than off-the-shelf drones, assembled a surveillance net to monitor mining sites. What the decree lacked in Polish, the people supplied in resilience. By the 20th hour, the control room in the capital was lit like a battlefield map. Screens displayed mines in green for compliance, yellow for review, and red for defiance. Slowly, the red patches shrank, replaced by hesitant agreements and provisional signatures. Yet beneath the progress, tension built, for everyone knew another clock was ticking. Washington's demand had not vanished. Its 48-hour countdown approached, and with it came the threat of frozen transfers, seized accounts, and strangled exports. If the dollar channels closed, could the 72-hour decree survive? Or would the order, stamped with courage, collapse under the weight of financial reality? Hour 24 struck, and the question sharpened. Would Burkina Faso bow to the foreign deadline, or would the defiant decree hold until the 72nd hour? By the 30th hour, the struggle was no longer confined to ministerial orders. It had spilled into the veins of the nation. A depot fire erupted on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, quickly contained, but unmistakably sabotage. Investigators traced suspicious transfers through ministry accounts, and within hours, 2 officials were removed from their posts. The message was clear. The state would not tolerate betrayal at a moment when survival depended on unity. On the ground, the contest sharpened. At one mining site, drones swept low across the perimeter, cataloging stockpiles from the air. At another, convoys were halted, manifests compared against the new national registry. Trucks that failed the check were turned back under armed escort. There were no fiery speeches, only cold administrative power. Yet resistance persisted. Some operators complied quickly, recognizing the inevitability of state control. Others hesitated, calculating that Washington's 48-hour clock might render the 72-hour decree meaningless. A few threatened to withdraw entirely, wagering that global finance would side with them. Meanwhile, the people of Burkina Faso lived the ultimatum minute by minute. In villages, elders opened radio lines to report suspicious activity directly to security forces. Young engineers, resourceful and unrelenting, converted consumer drones into a surveillance network, patchy but effective. Miners, unpaid but unyielding, guarded stockpiles overnight with lanterns and rifles. The state's authority no longer rested solely on decrees. It was reinforced by the watchful eyes and calloused hands of its people. As the 48th hour neared, tension crystallized. Inside the control room, screens flickered red as test transfers routed through New York were blocked. For the first time, evidence of Washington's leverage was undeniable. No cash, no wire, no liquidity. The ultimatum was no longer just a threat. It was machinery grinding into motion. A hush fell over the capital. Would wages vanish? Fuel depots empty? Shelves thin? The answer lay in the quick pivot that followed. Traoré's advisors proposed a backup grid. Settlements through Sahel banks, barter trades in regional currencies, gold for grain swaps with neighbors, imperfect, fragile, clumsy, but enough to keep oxygen flowing through an economy being strangled. By hour 45, Ouagadougou's streets pulsed with unease. Foreign media blared collapse, announcing that Burkina Faso had been severed from the dollar's lifeline. National broadcasts countered, insisting the transition was intact. Shopkeepers stacked smaller piles of cash. Miners awaited uncertain wages. Truckers idled at depots. Between rumor and resolve, the nation held its breath. Then came the words from Traoré himself, spoken to his advisors but carried swiftly to the markets and tea houses. This is a sovereignty test.
Our law, they will not operate here.
It was both defiance and declaration, a reminder that this confrontation was not merely about contracts or accounts, but about dignity. The right to determine one's own economy without foreign signatures. Hour 47. Washington's clock loomed. Analysts predicted the dollar cutoff would strike within minutes. In the control room, panic edged close, but then a courier burst through the door. The People's Resource Fund had received its first deposit, not through blocked wires, but in physical gold delivered directly, bypassing the frozen system. The room erupted in cheers. It was not victory, but survival. Enough to prove that the 72-hour order was not a paper shield. Enough to show that the state could improvise, adapt, and endure. And so the stage was set. One clock had bitten, freezing the arteries of international finance. The other had not broken, feeding its system through grit and regional ingenuity. Hour 48 arrived. 2 ultimatums, 2 realities. One demanded compliance through fear. The other held ground through action. The world watched to see which would collapse first. By the 50th hour, the confrontation was no longer an abstract duel of decrees. It had seeped into everyday life. Shopkeepers in Ouagadougou raised prices overnight, uncertain if supplies would arrive. Taxi drivers refused long journeys, afraid that fuel stations would run dry before dawn. Housewives counted smaller stacks of banknotes, each purchase now heavier with worry. The blockade of dollar channels struck hardest in the streets. With international payments frozen, imports slowed, food queues lengthened, and whispers of scarcity moved through markets. Traders speculated against the local currency, betting that its value would collapse under the pressure. To many outside observers, the nation seemed perched on the edge of default. Yet inside Burkina Faso, another story was unfolding. One not of surrender, but of adaptation. Traoré ordered emergency stipends for miners, paid not in blocked dollars but in gold-backed credits redeemable locally. Foreign commentators mocked the move as primitive, but in the mining towns, relief was real. A miner in Kaya held his pay slip and said, "At least we are still working." Villagers cheered when grain trucks rerouted through Sahel partner banks arrived, delivering bread and medicine despite the financial siege. The message was unmistakable. Dignity did not vanish when dollar wires froze. It endured in the ability to improvise, to trade in one's own terms, however fragile those terms might be. Still, the strain was undeniable. Businesses hesitated to comply with the new order, fearful of international retaliation. Some foreign operators packed up equipment, waiting for the United States to enforce its clock. Convoys stalled at checkpoints, caught between expired contracts and the authority of the new decree. The economy did not collapse, but it did slow, grinding with the friction of transition. Politically, however, the confrontation sharpened Traoré's image. No longer just a transitional leader, he became the face of defiance. His words echoed through tea shops and mosques. "This is our sovereignty test." For many citizens, the ultimatum was no longer about gold or oil, but about the right to stand upright without permission from abroad. Opposition voices raised concern. What if the blockade deepened? What if wages failed to arrive next month? Yet even critics conceded that never before had the nation responded with such unity across villages, miners, and ministries. The confrontation had, in its hardship, revealed a resilience often overlooked. Internationally, analysts debated whether this moment would define the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. Was it reckless defiance that would push Burkina Faso toward economic collapse? Or was it a defining stand that would enshrine his name in Africa's story of sovereignty? Either way, history was being written hour by hour. By hour 60, the tension was almost unbearable. Children waved flags in the streets, while parents worried about empty shelves. Banks processed regional trades through Sahel partners, yet uncertainty gnawed at every corner. Would this fragile system, patched together with gold swaps and neighborly convoys, endure long enough for the 72-hour clock to strike? Or would the weight of blocked dollars finally tip the balance and break the new foundation before it solidified? The nation stood suspended between fear and pride, waiting for the next decisive hour. Beyond Ouagadougou, the clash between two clocks reverberated across continents. In Washington, analysts described Burkina Faso as a test case, a nation too small to resist financial pressure, yet audacious enough to challenge it. The 48-hour demand was meant not only to bend a landlocked state, but to signal to all of Africa that defiance carried consequences. Across European capitals, the response was mixed. Some officials echoed the American line, framing Burkina Faso's decree as reckless nationalism bound to implode. Others, quieter but attentive, watched with unease. If one of the world's poorest nations could improvise survival outside dollar channels, what precedent might it set for others? Silence in Brussels and Paris masked a deeper anxiety that the experiment might work. Regional blocs reacted with sharper edges. The economic community of West African states hesitated, its members divided between loyalty to Western partners and sympathy for a fellow African government under siege. The African Union issued cautious statements about stability, wary of taking sides in a confrontation so nakedly economic. But the true turning point came not from distant institutions, but from nearby allies. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders of Mali and Niger signed a joint pledge. If Burkina Faso's financial lifeline was cut, they would provide immediate settlement through gold and regional currency. Convoys loaded with grain, fuel, and medicine rolled across the borders, horns blaring, escorted by armed guards. Cameras captured villagers cheering as trucks entered Burkina Faso, proof that the 72-hour order was not a solitary gamble, but part of a collective stand. For the first time, foreign media could not frame the standoff as a lonely rebellion. The sight of Traoré standing shoulder to shoulder with Sahel leaders at the border shifted the narrative. No speeches were needed. The presence itself declared a new reality. International commentators began to ask a different question. Was this confrontation merely about resources, or was it the birth of a new bloc, united by necessity and welded by defiance? Could it be that the legacy of this moment would stretch beyond gold shipments and embargoes into the realm of long-term vision, a regional alliance shaping its own economic path? In think tanks from Washington to Paris, debates turned to the future. If the 48-hour demand failed, would it accelerate the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a vision of an Africa less dependent on external dictates, more bound together by shared sovereignty? The standoff was no longer one nation's ordeal. It had become a mirror in which the world saw either defiance doomed to collapse or the dawn of a new regional order. And as the convoy horns echoed through Ouagadougou's streets, the question grew louder. Had Washington overplayed its hand, turning a single ultimatum into the catalyst of a movement? By the 70th hour, the tension that once felt like a death watch had shifted into something else, a new foundation being poured in real time. Markets had not collapsed, though they trembled. Villages had not starved, though queues grew longer. Instead of submission, a fragile but undeniable resilience emerged. The question now was not simply whether Burkina Faso could survive 72 hours, but what came after. Could the decree become a model? Not just for defiance, but for redesigning the relationship between Africa and the world. One path stretched toward risk. Sanctions could deepen, investors could retreat, and sabotage might continue in shadows. A blockade, even softened by Sahel support, could still grind livelihoods down, month after month. Critics warned that pride alone could not pay wages or import medicine forever. But another path glimmered with opportunity. The convoys from Mali and Niger were not merely lifelines. They were proof of a possible economic framework built on regional solidarity. What began as improvisation could be structured into a durable system. Shared gold reserves, pooled infrastructure, barter networks insulated from external shocks. From scarcity could emerge sovereignty. For Traoré, the challenge was no longer only survival. It was transformation, to take the raw defiance of a 72-hour decree and shape it into long-term architecture. A currency backed not by distant institutions, but by African assets. Trade corridors linking Sahel neighbors. Agreements that valued not raw extraction, but value-added industry. The people, too, would carry the burden. They had tasted both hardship and dignity. They had queued at markets with thinner wallets, yet cheered when convoys crossed borders. Their endurance had turned slogans into lived reality. For them, the ultimatum was no longer about deadlines, but about the right to defend their soil and decide their future. And so the road ahead was both peril and promise. If resilience hardened into strategy, if unity outlasted crisis, the 72-hour decree might be remembered not just as a defiant gesture, but as the seed of a movement. A movement where sovereignty is not theory, but practice. Where every truck that crosses the border, every coin that circulates, every mine that operates under national authority becomes a declaration of independence. The countdown had ended, but another had begun. Not measured in hours, but in years. Could Burkina Faso and its allies carve a place in history where ultimata from abroad no longer defined their fate? The question lingered like a torch passed to the next chapter. When the clocks restart, will Africa walk the path of dependence once more, or will it march forward on the road it has begun to build? The clocks have stopped. The 72 hours have passed. Yet in the streets of Ouagadougou, the air is not heavy with defeat, but alive with sound. Radios playing victory songs, children waving flags, miners holding slips of pay backed by gold, not by foreign permission. What was meant to be collapse has turned into proof of endurance. Ibrahim Traoré stood before his nation and said simply, "We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood and we made it real. His words cut through the noise of foreign headlines. For Burkina Faso, this was more than survival. It was the transformation of an ultimatum into an act of sovereignty. The world had expected silence after the 48-hour demand. Instead, it witnessed a declaration written not on paper, but in convoys of grain, in villages guarding depots, in wages paid despite the blockade. What many called reckless became, in the eyes of millions, the birth of a legacy. The Ibrahim Traoré Legacy was not forged in calm speeches or polished treaties, but in the fire of confrontation where a nation refused to bow. Across Africa, neighbors watched with cautious hope. If Burkina Faso could resist, could others? If a landlocked state could bend but not break, what might a continent achieve if united? This is where the vision deepens, not just 72 hours of defiance, but the long horizon of the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. A dream where sovereignty is not episodic, but structural, woven into trade routes, currencies, and shared security. History will judge this moment not by whether every account was balanced or every export delivered on time. It will remember that one nation faced the weight of the world's reserve currency and did not collapse. It will remember that when told to surrender its soil, it answered with its own clock. And so we close not with an ending, but with a question. If one small nation can hold the line, what stops the rest from reclaiming their future? If this struggle speaks to your sense of justice, do not just watch, subscribe, share, and lend your voice. The